wanted to talk about Ukraine.
I do. It's being invaded by Russia right now. I imagine most people are aware of this. And I've been following it, pretty consistently since the beginning. Maybe more than most, but not as much as some. But when I saw that the counteroffensive recently, because maybe just to give a brief overview, Russia invaded Ukraine. What was the date on that? I have the chart here. February 24th. So it's a little over 6 months now. And basically it didn't go well at first for Russia. It hasn't really gone well, period, arguably, but they, did get a foothold into Ukraine early on. They kind of had to backtrack a bit. Basically over like the first month, there was a lot of back and forth a little bit. And then Russia was forced to sort of retreat from the capital, Kyiv, and sort of reorient the strategy to a longer term kind of war. And it turned into this kind of artillery slog between the two, which Ukraine doesn't have a ton of artillery, but Russia has a lot. Russia has a lot of artillery and tanks, but not very many people. Ukraine has a lot of people, but is relying on the West to supply tanks and artillery and other equipment, which it's finally accumulated enough, basically, to do a counteroffensive September 6th. And basically since then, people are kind of surprised at how successful this counteroffensive has been. They're forcing Russia back quite a bit. They recaptured? I don't know what it is now, but what is it? Over 1,000 square kilometers of roughly like a Rhode Island's worth of territory back.
Wow.
It's probably at this point. Yeah, it's been pretty rapid. And a total reversal, because basically Russia was very, very, very slowly making gains. I think somebody predicted that at the current rate, or at the rate at the time that Russia was making advances, the war should end sometime in about 2100.
Oh my God.
With about 40 million casualties. So it's, it was like, how long can this go on? And Russia has not formally declared war on Ukraine, so they haven't been able to mobilize their army. So that's part of their manpower issue.
Oh, interesting.
Which apparently they are now, there's enough pressure on Russia now to where they have mobilized recently, in the past couple of days, about 300,000 of their reserve troops.
Wow.
Which I don't know what sort of political gymnastics had to happen, for them to do that without officially declaring war on Ukraine. But that's happened, and it's sort of escalating things a little bit. But with that maybe sort of background, Ukraine's making advances, and everybody is kind of excited, at least in the West. And, there's still a sense that there is, a lot. It's not going to just be over overnight, right? There's even been some talks about possible peace talks in the near future, but I'm not sure. I'm not fresh within the last day or two on the news. But,
yeah, me neither.
Actually, my partner Megan is really into the stock market. It's been following some astrologers who use astrology in the stock market, which I guess has a long precedence. I guess JP Morgan said that millionaires, what did he say? I don't remember the quote, but basically said that, millionaires do this or whatever, and billionaires use astrology to trade in the stock market. So, yeah. Yep. So, it's pretty interesting. I've been learning quite a bit from her. But anyway, somebody, I guess, who had done some research said that about 80-something% of all moves that occur on a Mercury retrograde, unlike a Mercury station to retrograde, reverse by the end of the retrograde cycle. So,
interesting.
thinking about it in terms of that and just how much it coincided with the Mercury station, I can't help but be a little skeptical, or just mostly I'm taking a let's see approach.
Yeah,
Be
for
interesting to
sure.
see what happens. But like most offensives, generally in military terms, and probably likely at some point with Ukraine, because they have limitations on their equipment. They're relying almost entirely on Western imports.
Right.
And at some point, the momentum is going to peter out. Usually, offensives don't just continue indefinitely. At some point, you outrun your logistic supply line. You have to stop and you have to regroup your forces. Um, and we don't know, what Russia's going to do to counter it. There's some speculations. Some are scarier than others, but basically, to the degree that this is tied to the Mercury retrograde, one would expect something to shift, the momentum to shift
Right.
uh, about when it stations direct. Which, do you know off the top of your head what the date is on that?
I can look that up in AstroGold. So the next station is going to be October 2nd.
October 2nd.
In
Yeah, so that's about, what, 11 days, 10 days?
um yeah, 30 days has September, so 8 plus 2, 10 days, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know, I mean, it can go a lot of different ways. It doesn't seem highly probable that Russia has, the resources immediately to like reverse the gains that Ukraine has made.
Right.
But I would expect maybe the momentum to peter out at some point. But I really don't know. Again, I'm speculating, and I'm trying to treat this as much as, it maybe sounds messed up. I, I, I can't help it. I'm an opportunity to learn a little bit,
Yeah.
because it's a thing that's happening, and I can't change that it's happening. Um, but I can observe and see what happens and see how things correlate. Uh, but it was actually interesting. Maybe we should talk a little bit about the inception for the war.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Let me pull up that chart.
Because it gets, I mean, you're talking about like an inception for an event. You would think that like when the event visibly starts is probably when you want to cast the chart for.
Right.
Granted, and I haven't looked actually at the Crimea, the invasion of Crimea chart,
Oh,
but I
that would be
mean,
interesting
maybe
too.
that one's more influential. I don't know, because I did like a bit of a quick write up for um, what the inception seemed to be describing, using an Byzantine astrologer named Theophilus of Edessa, and he's an 8th century astrologer, and he wrote a whole book on military inceptions, basically how to win wars using
Oh,
astrology.
wow.
And he actually had like hands-on experience. He was from, what was it, Byzantine Rome, but he worked for the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and basically was an active, you know, consulting astrologer for the generals of the Ottoman Empire. So he was like applying these techniques, and a little bit about the Ottoman Empire. Like, if you fuck up, you're going to get your head cut off. So the stakes were high for him. So it's interesting that this must have worked to some degree for him. Now, I haven't like mastered the text, but using some of the basics that I've gleaned with this inception, which is for February 24th, 2022, Moscow, Russia, at 5:55 a.m. And I think Theophilus says that for the beginning of a campaign, you want to cast it for where the army is, but like there isn't, it doesn't work that way anymore. Like, we don't have like one army that
Yeah,
we send in, and it's a front, and it's a whole geographic region. So it
right.
sort of made sense to me to go with like the announcement of the campaign. Um,
Yeah, that makes sense.
first missile was launched shortly after his speech. But you get an interesting chart because you get a.
I was going to say that a couple things. The first one is that because we're talking about Ukraine, it's probably a good idea to um, clarify that the astrologer Theophilus is from Edessa, not Odessa, Ukraine. Because when I heard that, I was like,
Yes.
"Wait, he's an ancient Ukrainian astrologer. This is even better."
Oh
But no,
yeah, yeah, no,
he's from
yeah,
Edessa. And the second thing that I was going to say was
yeah,
that
Edessa.
um, the second thing I was going to say is that even though this might not be exactly where the military was, and you raise a really good point about militaries being dispersed, it's possible that because this is where Putin was, this might be
Mm-hmm.
the view of the war kind of from Putin's perspective, which I think would be really interesting. It might be interesting to compare like what was going on at that moment from, Moscow versus where President Zelensky is or was at the time.
Yeah. Wow, this is actually pretty nuts too. I just pulled up the Ukrainian chart, national birth chart, just for 24
Oh,
August 1991, Kiev at 6 p.m. Not be a perfect time, but it has the almost, I think, the exact same ascendant, 16 Capricorn, as the beginning of the war. Yeah, that's weird. The ascendant for the war inception is 16 degrees Capricorn,
it's
which is
weird to
interesting.
me that
Actually, I've been doing.
it's weird to me that this country is younger than I am.
Yeah, I know. It is weird. It's a thing. We were both born, I think, right before the fall of the Soviet Union.
I was born in '85, so a couple years before, but I
88.
remember when the wall fell.
Yeah, I was not conscious enough at the time to remember the actual wall falling.
I'm old.
But anyway, I know I mentioned to you that I got my hands on a copy of 36 Faces by Austin
Ooh,
Coppock, which is
you did not tell me that. Jealous?
I didn't. I thought maybe I did.
You
Oh,
didn't?
okay.
No.
Well, now the world knows, I guess. But it is the whole world, the whole 50 people that listen to this podcast. uh, it's an amazing book. Oh my god, I'm in love with it. And I've been going through it kind of over and over again. But I was actually just reading about this decan of Capricorn today, the second decan of Capricorn, where the ascendant is, and it's about trying to build things, projects that are kind of impossible, like
Interesting.
like basically projects that, yeah, they're sort of too big to be realized fully. So it seems kind of relevant for what's happening with Russia. If you think of the ascendant as the initiator of the action, uh, it's kind of like, I just blanked out for a second. Most people would agree that his plan was not realistic. He was hoping to invade Ukraine real quick, this nation of 60 million people, and just sort of topple the government and establish a puppet government, and slowly annex the country. Which, in retrospect, is absurd. I mean,
Right.
knowing what we know now, it's pretty ridiculous to think that he could have pulled that off. But he did, and I think that's still kind of what he's shooting for, and almost what he has to do in order to justify the catastrophe that the war has represented for both Russia and Ukraine. But it's an interesting element. But then you think Ukraine has that same ascendant, and it's sort of I don't know what that's suggesting. I just saw it now, so occurring to me. But if you look at, was it the Ukrainian chart? I'm sorry, I'm bouncing around here because I'm
You're fine. You're
putting all
fine.
these pieces together. But yeah, Ukrainian birth chart is 16 degrees Capricorn rising, with the North Node exactly on the ascendant, right there with Neptune and Uranus, and they're all in that decan. And there just seemed to be. I have Neptune in the second decan of Capricorn, and I definitely have some impossible dreams. I've slowly become more realistic about them, but I don't know. There's something about Neptune in that decan that seems especially prone to emphasizing that theme.
Interesting.
It's one of the decans too, deeply tied with hubris as well, which makes more obvious sense for the inception of the war. Like, yeah, we're Russia, we're the shit, and we can just take over this country. And it's like,
Right.
no, not so much, not so quick. But I don't know what that means for Ukraine. I don't know, I guess, enough about the national history over the last 30 years.
Yeah, I feel like I should know more about the history of Ukraine. One of my friends in high school was a refugee from Ukraine, but she never, ever, ever wanted to talk about it. Probably for very good
Yeah,
reason.
yeah, not a pretty time. My first major girlfriend in high school was from Russia, which her and her family in many ways were kind of victims of the fall of the Soviet Union. It was not a pretty time to be in Eastern Europe.
No.
But anyway, where was it going? There's so many pieces to put together.
Right.
Um,
I'm noticing something interesting, which is that the descendant of the the Russo-Ukrainian war chart, the initiation of the conflict, is the descendant is exactly conjunct the South Node, and so like that descendant would be Ukraine. And thinking about this from an evolutionary perspective, I feel like I'm always jumping back to the nodes and being like, we have to talk about the nodes.
I don't think the North Node
But
is in the war chart. It's in the national chart of Ukraine.
well, I mean, they would both have nodes.
Well, yeah,
Um,
I'm just saying. In the Russo-Ukrainian war chart, the node is on the IC. Actually, that's interesting. The South node's on the MC, and the North node's on the IC. But in the Ukrainian national chart, the South node is on the descendant, and the North node is on the ascendant.
oh yeah. No, I'm being confusing. I'm doing a bit of synastry.
Oh yeah.
So
Oh yeah. Oh okay. Gotcha.
yeah,
Oh, I got
so
you now. Okay.
so the descendant of the war chart is almost exactly, it's within 2 degrees conjunct Ukraine's south node, and they're both in Cancer.
Mm-hmm.
16 degrees for the descendant and 18 degrees for the south node. And the south node is the past, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a past that you want to get away from. And
Uh-huh.
Cancer, one of the archetypes of Cancer is the mother, and so it's like the 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 enemy here is like, it's like you're running away from mom.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing with the moon too. Is it has that warm motherly quality, but it
Yeah.
inherently contains the archetype of the all-devouring, smothering mother.
Yes.
Which, Mother Russia, in some ways, is kind of that. She's coming back. She's like, no, you're not ready to grow up.
Yeah.
Get back in the basement.
The basement, huh?
Yeah, or wherever. I imagine Ukraine at this point is probably going to be put in Russia's basement.
Yeah, for
They don't get
sure.
their own, they don't get a nice room above ground yet. Because the Russia's going to be pissed if they are successful in annexing. Which, again, I'm not trying to make big solid predictions here, but there's a few things that about the astrology that again, not a master of this, but there's like the inception chart, right? Which I should maybe lay out a couple basic rules, is that in an inception, the initiator of the action is the first house. And in a war, it's basically the declarer of the war, the aggressive army. And the seventh house would be the defending army, the one who's being invaded. So that would be Ukraine. And The second house describes allies as well as resources. You'd think the 11th, right? But it's primarily the second in war inceptions, and likewise with the 8th. And then, so with Russia, looking at like the Venus-Mars conjunction on the ascent, that's like rising in the chart, because Venus is right before that conjunction went exact back in February, and Venus is at 21 degrees, Mars is at 22 degrees Capricorn, the ascendant's at 16, so they're in the process of rising, and Theophilus of Edessa would have called that quite favorable, especially in a night chart with an exalted Mars in Capricorn, and then benefic Venus, which in war basically means booty. It means victory.
Interesting.
So, having those two together can be kind of awesome in a chart, in an inception for astrology. You probably, if I was going to pick, like if I was going to declare war on someone, I would probably put those two on the ascendant. The fact that they're about to make a conjunction with Pluto is a little more of a puts a twist on things.
Right.
In my mind, it's like Theophilus didn't know about Pluto, and I think we're still figuring out Pluto to a large degree. Only known about it for less than 100 years now.
About 90,
so
yeah.
We don't know exactly what kind of wild twists that could point to. The ones that come to mind, I don't like very much.
Yes.
But it does sort of bring to mind that theme of the possessive mother a little bit, or like that all-consuming kind of power, wanting to reassimilate into a lost political structure, taken to the extreme. But Pluto doesn't, I don't know. I mean, there's ways that Pluto, I don't like blanket assume that Pluto's a malefic. Not inherently, or not in the same way like maybe Mars and Saturn might be. It's not like a benefic, but it's maybe.
No.
But actually, I think of somebody on Instagram recently just suggest the idea that all outer planets are functionally malefic because they deal with things that are outside of our general understanding. So they're generally things that we have to grapple with. They're sort of difficult to handle.
Yeah, for sure.
That makes sense to me. But I guess you got to put them in a different category. But yeah. So anyway, you have this kind of awesome first house for Russia in this chart, and then you look at maybe the condition of the seventh house, which there are no planets in it, but it's Cancer, so presumably ruled by the moon, which is in the 12th house in Sagittarius, which Theophilus would probably say not great.
Yeah,
but
self-undoing.
There's other components to that. Yeah, but I mean, is it undoing the first? Undermining the first house? That the 12th generally suggests. It's in the house of enemies, for sure. And a lot, one of my initial sort of reactions was like, maybe, Russia will win, but they're going to have a major insurgency on their hands. Because the moon...
they definitely will if they win. I don't think that it takes any kind of prophecy to predict that. Ukraine is not going to go down easy.
Mm-mm.
I mean, we've seen that already.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and there's a ton of different ways of looking at it, too. I mean, you have the moon in Sag. It's waning in light, because we got the sun in Pisces at 5, so it's just going into the last quarter phase, which not the strongest place for the moon, generally speaking. It's generally sort of reducing and taking something away. Who it's taking something away from is maybe a little more of an open question, but it's also ruled by Jupiter in Pisces, which is in the third house of the chart, which would make it cadent, which is not like the strongest place for Jupiter, but it's a very dignified Jupiter. So it's kind of supported in a way that's like strong, but not like outwardly powerful, which makes sense for the Ukrainian army. It's taken time to build up the resources. And then you think about the fact that the ascendant in this chart would be ruled by Saturn in the second house, which, it's dignified Saturn, which just adds to the whole dignity of it. But then you think that Saturn is in a night chart. And when I think about like night chart Saturn, it's maybe in a really dignified position. I tend to think of like harsh and maybe right to some degree, or like has backing by social structure in some way, but not necessarily geared towards your benefit all the time, which in this case, and in the House of Allies even, a lot of themes come up. Is it like starting the war literally ostracized Russia from the political international community? Like they're pariahs now.
Right.
But on another angle, they are also sort of collecting allies amongst the outcasts of the world, which is not even maybe an accurate term, but they are the people who have not benefited from the Western political order. They're people who are actually, want to see that order shift towards their faith. So thinking about like China as being one who would like to see, the U.S. reduced in power. Out of sex Saturn, like you can see how, out of sex Saturn and Aquarius, it just makes intuitive sense to me how that could be drawing away a little bit on the allies, but also possibly creating something solid and enduring long term. Which one of the big things that they talked about, and I'm sorry, I'm just talking and talking, but one of the
it's interesting. I think so anyway.
One of the big themes, what surprised everybody about the start of the Ukrainian war was that the EU ended up being really strengthened by it. It sort of regalvanized the idea of the EU and NATO, which had been all kind of like, like, what are we doing here? Are we really in an alliance? Like they kind of needed an enemy to sort of unify them. Right. So there's sort of this theme of like, unifying one's enemies, but also, I don't know, like Saturn creates hard boundaries between things, so it's kind of like dividing the world,
right?
In a way that's kind of scary. And I'm not. My plan is not to be a fearmongerer in this case.
Oh, of course not.
But maybe to end my rant for a second, one other note I wanted to add that I only recently started thinking about differently because an astrologer friend of mine who I thought of as being pretty hardcore traditional for a long time switched over to Placidius, or using Placidius and whole sign houses. And
really?
Give me a good explanation for it, and it made sense to me. So I'm like, oh, okay, maybe I'll consider this. But you basically use the quadrant house system to assess kind of the strength of a planet, but also maybe the subjective perspective on the experience of it, which I know that's a popular way to use Placidius now. It's like psychological.
Right.
But if you view things from that angle, the moon, which rules the seventh house, is kind of angular, actually, because the midheaven's at 27 Scorpio.
Right.
It means the midheaven is approaching the moon about 10 degrees away, and while the moon is in the 12th house, by quadrant, it's angular.
Mm-hmm.
In probably the 10th house. Actually, I haven't looked at it, but I'm sort of curious to see if it actually is in the 10th. Presumably it is. That would be a really tiny 10th house for Placidius.
Yeah, I can pull up this chart in Placidus pretty easily. This one
probably looks really weird on Placidius because the midheaven and the ascendant are 45 degrees from each other.
Yeah, so in Placidus, the distance between the Oh my goodness. The midheaven, which in Placidus is the 10th house cusp, is at 27 degrees of Scorpio. And the
Yeah.
cusp of the 11th house is at 14 degrees of Sagittarius.
Yeah.
So,
So the moon
like,
would be in the 10th.
half a degree. Yeah. Yep. The moon's in the 10th.
So arguably using actually Edessa's um, rules to some degree, the ruler of the 7th would be in a stronger position. It would be in an overcoming kind of position
Right.
with the first house. But then when you think that it's in the 12th and it's doing so in like a undermining kind of way, or like a more of a slower way, but also in a
Right.
way that for Ukraine, I mean, they're going to be screwed for a long time.
Right.
It's going to take so long for their economy to recover after this. But they're also, sort of realizing a new national identity out of it
Mm-hmm.
too. There's a lot of like pride um, and unity that's coming out of Ukraine, which I guess we'll see what the long term of that is. But
And a lot
yeah,
of people who had no idea pretty much anything about Ukraine um, are suddenly much more, even though the news isn't reporting on it anymore. Like you say, Ukraine, and people who, were too young to remember the Cold War or just haven't really been paying attention. This has really raised awareness, at least in the United States, of Ukraine and its issues, and I don't think that's going to be likely to go away anytime soon.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's kind of fallen out of fashion a little bit, like the original craze, but
Right.
surprisingly still like relevant to a lot of people. It was driving by a city. What do you call those things? City, where like the town hall is and the courthouse is,
Mm.
civic center,
Yeah.
and there was a Ukraine flag along with the U.S. flag.
Oh.
So
Oh,
there's a
that's
lot of
nice.
it's hip. It's hip to support Ukraine right now.
I was looking at that Pluto in the first house, and one of the issues that at least Democracy Now! Has been reporting on quite a lot is what's going on with all of the nuclear reactors in Ukraine. And for a while
Yes.
there, we were concerned about, are they going to mess with Chernobyl? Are they going to cause other reactors to blow up? Because there are like a lot of nuclear reactors in Ukraine, and I think that maybe one of the biggest, if not the biggest, reactor in Europe is in Ukraine. So
Mm-hmm.
everybody is really concerned about that. So while we were talking, I pulled up the chart for the moment when the test that caused the meltdown at Chernobyl,
Oh yeah,
when that
yeah.
officially began. And I was expecting there to be some kind of connection between the Plutos in those charts. And I found out that I was wrong about that. But Jupiter is going through almost an exact it's going to be going through a no. So at the time that the war started, Jupiter was at 12 degrees of Pisces, and when the nuclear test began in Chernobyl, it was at 14 degrees of Pisces. So Jupiter is going through a return since the Chernobyl test began,
Mm.
which means that it has almost definitely the Jupiter return was exact at some point between now and when the war started, because of course now Jupiter's in Aries, but they were
Mm.
only 2 degrees apart and Jupiter was applying. So
There was hey, I'm just going by because you showed me the chart before. And there was a Taurus Scorpio eclipse, right?
da, da, da,
I'm
da.
remembering that right. I think the moon was in Scorpio, the
um
sun was in Taurus.
I'm having the
So
hardest time
Chernobyl.
reading Biweld charts for some reason. So the moon in the Chernobyl chart was at 24 degrees of Scorpio. Yep. And the south node was at 26 degrees of Scorpio. Um,
Oh crap! That's a nodal return
yeah.
too. This on
Yeah.
the Inception chart. That's exact nodal return. Oh boy, I don't like that.
Yeah, I don't like that
I'm really
either.
trying not to like read heavily into the nuclear component because
That's
it's so
terrifying.
unthinkable, and so it is terrifying. There's a couple other things I don't love, um, like the U.S. chart. I think Mars is going to go retrograde on the U.S. Uranus, I believe.
Oh,
And
joy.
Mars had the U.S. chart, simply chart is Mars in Gemini, right?
Yes.
And I can't remember how it's hitting the natal Mars for the U.S., but I'm not in love with that. And uh, Mars is going to station retrograde on Zelensky's ascendant, fairly close. I think his ascendant's at like 21 Gemini.
Oh my goodness.
Mars is going to station at 25, so close. It's not like that precise, whoa hit, but it's like, because he's a day chart. You don't necessarily, love having Mars in the ascendant in a day
No.
chart. But then when you're thinking about things in terms of Theophilus's rules, like Mars is kind of in his hands to some degree.
Right.
It's generally much more favorable from a military perspective to have Mars rising on the ascendant than on the descendant. That's you getting your ass handed to you. So yeah, I don't rightly know or want even to make a really hard prediction on that. Because I guess, I mean, to be honest, like I like most people in the West, I want to see Ukraine prevail.
Right.
So I'm, I have biases that probably get in the way of me interpreting things. But I'm also a kind of I'm not a hyper predictive astrologer to begin with.
No, I think you've said I don't want to predict this at least 5 times in this episode so far.
Yeah, I don't. I really don't. Unless I'm going to get credit. Unless I'm right and I get credit for it and it makes me famous or something. No.
Heard right here on the Wandering Stars podcast.
Yeah. Though no, that's a whole other digression. I don't want to get off on that track. Though we could, because it's relevant right now, because the queen died.
Yes, she did.
We talked about the royal family before a little bit.
Quite a bit. That's my fault.
Yeah. Well, my partner was reading Nostradamus recently.
Really?
Which is interesting, and I didn't even realize how much Nostradamus was an astrologer. Like, he was primarily an astrologer.
Oh, yeah.
And yet I don't really hear astrologers talk about Nostradamus very much. Apparently he wasn't a particularly good one, at least by the standards of the time. He was not good at calculating charts. He would get things wrong a lot. And he would often have clients get their chart calculated with someone else and then bring them the chart. Or do it themselves or something. Yeah. But it's interesting.
So he used astrology software.
Basically, yeah. He outsourced the calculation like we do now. And yeah, I guess I was trying to get a sense of like how he did predictions and stuff. And apparently by his own acclamation that they were mostly with astrology primarily. And, do any weird, like, God, I can't remember the other things that was suggested, like staring into bowls of liquid of some kind or another.
Scrying?
Scrying, yeah. I think it was mainly just astrology. Like, it wasn't like he had these crazy visions so much.
Interesting.
But, yeah. I guess he apparently, Nostradamus, predicted the death of the queen pretty accurately.
Really?
In 2022. And that
what did he say?
I don't remember exactly, but I think something like the queen, will die, whatever, because he does them in the quatrains and like they get sort of dated. And what did he say? That a man who never expected to be king will become king.
Well, that's certainly true, isn't it?
Yeah, though, I mean, he expected to be king at some point, but then he probably was like, "Ugh, it's never going to happen. Is she ever going to die?"
Well, he never wanted to
But
be king. So I think he went from not wanting to be king and wanting to find a way out of it to
okay,
going, all right. So I'm getting
yeah,
older here, and my mom is apparently immortal. So
yeah. But you probably know more about this stuff than I do. I'm not an expert on the ins and outs of the royal family, but I know he said that uh, the next year, which I guess would be 2023, the wife will be wronged in some way of the great man, of the King of England. I
oh,
guess
really?
the people will overthrow him, and maybe that's when he said that a man who never expected to be king will become king. Um, which has me wondering, because I offhand once said this about Prince Harry, um,
Yeah.
that his chart is so similar to Queen Elizabeth. And there's a lot about his chart compared to his brother, Prince William.
William.
Yeah, okay. That's a little more eminent in a lot of ways, but just the
Yeah.
weird parallels with him and Queen Elizabeth, and like, I don't know, it kind of got me thinking, should I be trying to predict that Prince Harry will somehow become king? Because uh, that would probably make me really popular if I was right.
It would certainly make you really popular, especially in the States.
Yeah. Hmm. But he is certainly not expected to be king.
No.
And it would probably take a series of tragedies for that to happen. But I don't know.
I
That's the extent of my
believe that
thoughts
they
on it
no
at
longer
this point.
follow the rule that um, the heir to the throne and his children have to fly in separate planes. I believe that was a rule for quite
Ugh.
a while. So I am not predicting this, and I don't want this to happen. But
Yeah.
all it would take for Harry to become heir to the throne would be for something tragic to happen to the Cambridges. So
Yeah.
some kind of travel accident, like that's, and I'm not wanting to give anyone ideas here, but
Yeah.
that is the way that it could
Yeah.
happen
We might
theoretically.
have the British secret, well, whatever the British, what is it? The Secret Service in England is called something else.
Oh no, isn't it
Might be the Secret Service,
007?
but I don't remember what they have a saying, but they may come in and assassinate us now. Yeah, I don't know, and I don't know. Prince George's chart's a little. It's not the best. It's not the worst. It could be a lot worse, but there's a thing with Prince George. I'm just going off memory, but he, like their whole family has dignified Moon and dignified or exalted Venus. But
Really?
he has both in their detriment and fall. He has the Moon in Capricorn, and Venus in Virgo, which is quite a
Oh,
contrast to like the family history. And then he has Mars in Cancer, and I'm thinking that it rules the ascendant even. But it's conjunct Jupiter in Cancer, which is nice. But hard to say. And I'm not that I'm like falls immediately mean bad things. I mean, it could mean that he becomes
no,
king
no,
and
no.
it's like, fuck this. This is stupid. Maybe we don't even do this. uh, yeah, I think it's in the ninth. I'd have to look at the chart again, but I already have like 10 charts open.
Yeah, me too. I'm so glad that Astro Gold can handle it. But my understanding, and I can definitely be wrong about this, but from what I've read, the royal family has definitely not told George at this point that he's heir to the throne, and they might not even raise him to assume that he's going to be king because they're estimating that the monarchy is not going to exist at that point. Um, I might be
Yeah.
wrong about that, but I've read that several places, so
Hmm.
maybe it's anti-royalist propaganda.
Yeah. His younger brother actually has a really much nicer chart. Which again, and actually, I wanted to make this point a while ago, because I've been looking at a lot of king charts, kings and queens and stuff,
Right.
and a lot of their charts are pretty gnarly, and it
Really?
basically makes me think that like being a king is not so awesome. It kind of sucks, especially for the royal family. I mean, they're basically slaves
Mm,
to the government. Like they are government. They are a government institution,
right.
and they are servants of the state.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't actually have any political power. They can't vote. They can't even have political opinions.
Mm-hmm.
They're just there as kind of figureheads. They're like they're in kind of a gilded cage. They
I was
get
just
a lot
thinking
of
that.
support. But yeah, their lives are very much not their own, which I think
They
makes
have a
sense
lot of
for
money, but
yeah, yeah,
do
but
they really have the freedom to spend it? I mean, I've read articles that have talked about how they have to dress, and like not only is
mhm.
there a strict dress code, but like they're limited in the types of fabrics that they can wear because they need to make sure that like they will hang properly and they're not going to get wrinkled in the car. And so like the range at which they can express themselves is incredibly small, and then it's even smaller for practical reasons. And so like obviously clothes aren't everything, but when you're a figurehead and pretty much the only thing that you can do is stand out in public and look nice, and you don't even have like the ability to choose what you're going to wear, like at least Melania Trump had that.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, they really don't have agency, like at all. Which actually, in a lot of ways, Prince William, I know he's a Sag rising with Jupiter and Scorpio, so in the 12th. And
Interesting.
the thing that struck me about that, I was like, well, all the rulers of their first houses are in Scorpio. It's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
What is it?
Secrets.
Prince Harry, Capricorn rising, Saturn in Scorpio. Queen Elizabeth, Capricorn rising, with Saturn in Scorpio. Same degrees. Prince William, Sagittarius rising with Jupiter in Scorpio. Who's the king now again? King
Charles.
Charles.
Charles the Third.
Leo rising with Sun in Scorpio. And that's all I have at the moment.
Oh
That's
my
coming to mind.
goodness.
But there's some Scorpio themes with this family that are very consistent.
Yeah, that's like a freaking X-Files thing. Like, trust no one.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Let me look at Prince George, because if he is a Scorpio rising with Mars and Cancer, that would be interesting. Because it's almost like a
Mm-hmm.
twist on the Scorpio theme.
Yeah.
But how do we even get off on this track? When we talking about the Ukraine war?
We were
Yep,
talking
Scorpio
about the
rising.
Ukrainian war.
Yes. But he is a
Wow.
Scorpio rising. Mars in Cancer conjunct Jupiter in Cancer, which is very helpful. But yeah, I don't know. I don't think this kid's going to want to be king.
Well, his grandfather certainly didn't.
Yeah. Did
Oh,
Prince
yeah.
Charles not want to be king?
Oh, no, he did not want to be king at all.
Hmm.
He has very strong political opinions about things, and is the
Yeah.
kind of person who really wants to be able to make a difference, and he's put in a position where like theoretically he's the head of the country, but he can't really, like you said, do anything. And a lot of the
Yeah.
things that he was doing before, now that his mother is dead, he can't really continue to do them anymore. He was doing a lot of stuff for the environment and helping entrepreneurs, I think. And he's got to stop all that now because it's political opinions.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you have a lot more ability to do stuff as not king.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, you're basically like an ornament for the state. And, a bunch of people love you, a bunch of people hate you. But you're just kind of there as like an ornament in a lot of ways, and a figurehead and kind of emotional support, maybe like
Mm-hmm.
for everyone. It makes people feel good that the king or the queen is there. But
it's kind of like the
yeah,
king in chess. Like the king in chess can't really do anything, and yet the entire game revolves around it. And
I'm
like it's
protecting
almost
it.
like
Yeah,
the prime minister is the queen. The queen's the one who actually gets stuff done
I know.
and has the freedom to
Great
move.
things about chess is I feel like it's such a like a covertly feminist game or something. Like just chess.
I love it.
The most powerful piece is the queen.
Yep.
And a lot of like in tournaments, sometimes if you lose your queen early, like people will just bow out of the game.
Wow.
So it's like,
I love that.
you just lost your queen embarrassingly, so just quit. Because you're making a fool of yourself at this point.
Well, there's that saying, the power behind the throne.
Yeah. One that's yeah. I don't know. I don't think I'd want to be a king or a queen. It looks like it sucks.
Yeah.
Even if you do have like absolute power, you're still kind of beholden to it.
Yeah.
I think we talked about this a lot. We were doing science episodes on Astrology Hotline with Leo and Aquarius and that axis. She talks a lot about like that, like the isolation, the separateness of royalty, being
right.
By being held above, you're being held separate, and it's also kind of it's a burden, and it's something you're yoked to, you're saddled to it. Like you don't get to just leave. It's like you leave when you die. When you die naturally, or when someone kills you and takes the throne from you. Like you don't get to just quit. Though people have abdicated, but probably only when kind of extreme circumstances.
Right. I mean, Charles's great uncle did that famously, so that he could marry the woman he loved. Speaking of, well, she didn't become a queen, but she could have, maybe.
Well, there's a whole thing with the British family, because they're the head of church. It's just basically the head of the Church of England is like probably their biggest role at this point. That's part of the issue, is that like officially the head of the Church of England is against divorce.
Right.
And they there's been some divorces going on with I was at Camilla, Prince. God, there's so many Anglo-Saxon names I can't remember. King George, King, what's his name? Harry. God damn. Who's the king now?
Charles is king now.
Charles. Okay, so King Charles, his wife. Well,
Camilla.
he was divorced from Prince Diana and remarried Camilla, and Camilla was a divorcee, I believe.
Right.
And there's a lot of scandal around their relationship because he was basically, I think, cheating on Princess Diana with Camilla, which is, very not Church of England, which I think Nostradamus was indicating was what is going to be the issue around the king at this time.
Interesting.
Is why possibly another king may come that is, never expected to be on the throne. But I really need to look at, actually, it's a study I want to do at some point. It's looking at all the astrological language that are in Nostradamus's, what do you call them? Quatrains in his prophecies? Because there's a ton of it. They all have like indications towards Mars with the lion or things like that.
That is such a fascinating study. You should totally do that.
I plan to. It's time. Gotta find time for
I know exactly
so many
what
things
you mean.
to be interested in.
Oh yeah.
But and I mean, he was an astrologer, so I'm wondering if he was just looking at like astrological alignments and like, oh, this looks like this, and I don't know how he pulled all the little details out of it, but
yeah,
I don't know. I would like to study Nostradamus more. He has a gnarly chart.
Does he really?
Oh yeah. It's, what is it? So Cancer on the 4th house. What does that make you rising? Aries. He's an Aries rising with Mars conjunct Saturn and Jupiter also probably helped. But Mars conjunct Saturn in Cancer in the 4th, ruling the ascendant, and then Moon and Scorpio in the 8th house, and then I had some Virgo shit. I can't remember now, but yeah, a lot of fallen planets, which I have this theory about fallen planets and having something to do with prophecy.
Interesting.
I haven't pieced it all together in my mind yet, but whenever you look at like depictions of like prophets, or even spiritual advisors in like historical contexts, they were outcasts. Like they lived elsewhere. They were weirdos, and they lived away from the community. Is it like the Oracle of Delphi? Lived on a mountain, snorting whatever gas came out of the but I looked at the charts for all the outer planet discoveries. Every one of them has the moon in Scorpio. I don't know what that means exactly, but every single one, yeah, look at them. Neptune, Pluto, and Uranus.
Well, you have the moon in Scorpio, so you're supposed to understand, right? It means you can empathize with all the other planets, right?
I guess. Maybe it has something, I don't know, something to do with looking outside of the established container, if you will. But all fallen planets are planets in detriment. They're operating outside the bounds of the expectations of that planet,
right,
in some way. But I don't even know. I can see how the moon in Scorpio would be possibly a good prophet, because highly intuitive, picks up on little details of everything.
Yeah.
The problem is that you need a good filtration system to figure out what of that is actually relevant.
Right.
You can also just be being paranoid and anxious about minor things, blowing them out of proportion.
It's true. And prophets tend to not be very well received, a bit like the moon in Scorpio. I mean, there's a reason why Cassandra is a word that I don't know if everyone knows, but a lot of people do.
Yeah. Well, that's why Nostradamus veiled his quatrains in like such cryptic language, because the Inquisition was active, and he didn't want to get burned alive.
Oh, of course.
He's like, I'm not a prophet. He said it over and over again. I'm not a prophet. I'm not a prophet. And yet he published a book called Prophecies.
Oh my goodness.
Like, well, what are you if you're... I wrote a book of prophecies. That does not make me a prophet.
Huh. Well, I mean, this does explain with, your moon in Scorpio, why you don't want to be predicting anything today.
Well,
I mean, that must be the reason, right?
I don't know if it's the reason. I think, I don't know, it could be... You could point to Saturn too, maybe, if you want. I don't know. There's something about it where I guess I don't fully trust my emotional reactions to things, which for valid reasons, because they can be out of proportion sometimes. But sometimes I pick up on stuff that, that would maybe go under the radar for other people. It's just maybe not. It's just not always knowing, which of those things, what is actually. Just because you feel something strongly doesn't mean it's true.
Absolutely.
Actually, we were my friend Joji was on Astrology Hotline recently, and we were talking about which planet rules astrology. And traditionally it's Mercury,
right?
But other planets have been sort of given that label. But we ended up just going through all the planets and sort of talking about their approach to astrology, and talking about the moon and its approach to maybe not, astrology, but like divination in general. And it's that very intuitive approach where you're not looking at all the details. You sort of take in the details and then just sort of let them sit and be homogenate, which is not a real word, but sort of emulsify internally and see what, you feel. You feel into the chart. Or like with tarot, you do, you look at the cards and you kind of pick out what grabs you and, lean into that.
Right.
But it's not like a mathematical delineation with the moon. It's like an impression, which can be a lot, Your conscious could be putting stuff together in ways that your conscious mind can't. And you're just like, I got something here. And if you trust it, then, it may be true. How do you know?